Welcome to SilviCast, the podcast about all things silviculture. My name is Greg Edge.
And I'm Brad Hutnick.
And we are both silviculturists with Wisconsin DNR Division of Forestry and your hosts for today's show. Brad, what on earth are you doing? I saw the smoke all the way from Lone Rock. And as I got closer, I thought, oh my gosh, the Hutnick house is on fire. And then I thought, well, maybe those experiments of yours in the garage just finally went awry.
Greg, there's a feeling I get when I look to the west and my spirit is crying for leaving. In my thoughts, I've seen rings of smoke through the trees and the voices of those who stand looking. Ooh, it makes me wonder.
Oh, great. Now Brad's on a Stairway to Heaven trip again. Brad, get out of the smoke column.
Yeah, not Greg. It's not that kind of smoke column, right? This is, but it is spring green. You never know. But no, this is just a little neighborhood prescribed burn.
In your backyard?
Sure. My neighbors and I have this postage stamp of woods behind our houses, and there's nothing like, and there's nothing like a good release burn to get things going. Well, I guess it's a release. It could be a site prep burn, or I guess it's kind of a restoration burn too, but.
Okay, let's not get technical, but this is the middle of spring green, Brad.
No, precisely. This is spring green, Greg. We don't get all that uptight about a little fire and a little smoke around here. And truth be told, I do have a burn permit.
Well, okay. I don't see much or any oak reproduction in there. What are you releasing?
Well, fair enough. I'm calling this a multi-treatment burn. We're going to control some invasives. You see that garlic mustard? So we got to stimulate little patches of prairie. We're going to prepare a seed bed. And maybe there's an oak seedling or two out there someplace. And restoring the natural disturbance regime of the driftless area I think it's an educational opportunity.
Yeah, I see some of last year's tomato plants in there too. So.
Yep.
Well, I think your neighbor is learning how done he likes his steaks. You live in a very interesting town, Brad.
Greg, this gets me fired up for our conversation today on SilviCast. Today, we're talking with Dr. Patrick Brose, a research forester with the U.S. Forest Service's Northern Research Station. Pat is seriously like Dr. Oak of the Eastern U.S. for all of his work on oak fire dynamics and management. A conversation with Dr. Brose, and I think even you will be planning a prescribed burn in your backyard.
I kind of doubt it.
The Family Forest Carbon Program pays landowners to improve the health of their land and increase the long-term value of their property. The program equips landowners with resources and support to implement sustainable practices that help them reach their goals while also improving the health of their forests and our planet. To learn more about how you can access these benefits for your forests, visit familyforestcarbon.org. And now, back to the show.
Pat Brose, welcome to SilviCast.
Appreciate the opportunity to talk with you today.
Yeah, it's great that you could join us. And Pat, we know you. We're familiar for sure with your research, but for our audience, can you tell us where you work and what your role is there?
I work at Forestry Sciences Lab in northern Pennsylvania. That's part of the Northern Research Station. I research forester here and work pretty much exclusively in oak silviculture.
I'm always a little confused as to how big the Northern Research Station is. Goes a long ways.
Yeah, it's the same as the Forest Service Region 9, Minnesota down to Missouri and then to the East Coast. So it's 18 or 20 states. It's pretty much the northeastern quarter of the United States.
So I just have to remember Region 9, Northern Research Station.
Yep. They're
I kind of know them.
One and the same.
And you've been doing some really interesting work on silvicultural implications of fire and just oak regeneration in general. And I was just going to tell a brief story. You wrote a paper a long time ago, and I think it was what you were talking about. It was one of the Central Hardwood conferences or something like that. But it was called Using Prescribed Fire to Regenerate Oaks with Van Leer and Kaiser. And I just remember that when I read that thing, that kind of I think that set me on a different course as a young forester.
I'm probably one of the few people that probably ever read the thing.
No, I don't think so. And there was a kind of that stick diagram in there about how you would use fire and the different things. And I think it was really nice. I've used it a million times. times. So you should get royalties for how many times I've used that.
Dave Van Leer was my major professor when I was a PhD student at Clemson, and Pat Kaiser at the time was a wildlife biologist with the Virginia Division of Game and Inland Fishery. And
Okay.
he was instrumental in my dissertation research. He had the lands in central Virginia where we were able to do the research that became my dissertation.
How long have you been involved in this whole area of oak silviculture, Pat?
Professionally, as a researcher, I'm going to say 25 years. Going back before that, plenty of involvement with oak forest. I grew up in western Pennsylvania, which is oak country, and I've been around oak forest pretty much the vast majority of my life.
So speaking of that, how did you actually get interested in forestry leading into doing some of the work you've done?
I grew up on a farm, and so I've been in the outdoors and outside pretty much my whole life. I've always been interested in pretty much anything to do with the outdoors. Got interested early on. The woods right next to the farm consisted of two hills. One was protected at the bottom by a swamp from any railroad fires coming up the slope from it, so it never burned. And it's all maple. Adjoining hill, exactly identical to it, except the swamp isn't at the bottom. Railroad track down there would set fires 2-3 times a decade, and that hillside was entirely oak. I remember when I went to Penn State and brought that fact up, and I heard at least 101 reasons on why fire could have absolutely nothing to do with that characteristic, that one hillside was oak, and the other hillside was maple. They had every other reason why it was other than fire.
That's really interesting. You could have started your PhD back on the farm.
So that's sort of what got me interested in that phenomenon. Whenever I'd seen that was just an observation of the hills right there by the farm, and went off to the university and found out that they didn't see things that way.
Huh.
So it's kind of interesting how I think a lot of people kind of make these observations or they piece things together. Was the conversation already kind of developing about, hey, there's an oak regeneration problem at that point when you were starting school, or did that predate working in school?
It definitely predates. It goes back probably to the 1920s or 1930s.
Oh, okay.
You'll actually find references in literature to difficulty of getting oak forests to regenerate, and really starts showing up in the scientific literature in the 50s and the 1960s.
But when you started there with your studies, they weren't thinking at that time that fire was a significant element of this particular system?
Mark Abrams, who was a assistant professor at Penn State when I was there, was certainly interested in that aspect of oak silviculture and was promoting it. But the actual practical applied, how do you do it, really hadn't come around yet. Those that were dabbling in fire were basically looking at fire as a pre-harvest treatment, and not so much looking at it as a treatment during a shelterwood sequence.
Pat, maybe a good place for us to start. Sometimes we kind of like to start with maybe some definitions so we're all on the same page. And one of the things that I use from your research is the fire oak literature synthesis that you were a co-author on, and I believe that was 2014. And in there, I really like the way it's broken down into utilizing fire in oak ecosystems for a seedbed preparation burning, for release burning, and then ecological restoration burning. And I'm just wondering if you could briefly explain the difference between those three.
Seedbed preparation burning is basically preparing the understory so when an acorn crop occurs, the new oak seedlings, the new germinates, have a very favorable light regime to start growing in. The understory competition has been reduced, the light levels have been increased slightly, so they have a decent environment in which to get started growing. Release burning is later in the regeneration process when those seedlings have had a chance to grow. Some they're 2-3 foot tall, they have some decent root systems to them, and that's done usually during a shelterwood sequence, or maybe shortly after the final harvest, when those oak seedlings are now being faced with incredible competition from mesophytic hardwoods. And there, the purpose of the fire there is different. It is to knock everything back to ground level and force everything to sprout. The oaks, because of their way they develop their root systems, are then at an advantage and can compete much better against their mesophytic neighbors. And then ecological restoration burning is similar to seedbed preparation burning. It's creating that open understory that was often commonly described by early settlers. There, it's again basically having oak seedlings on the forest floor established, so when there is some kind of disturbance, not necessarily a commercial harvest, that there's oak seedlings there to replace the overstoring oak tree.
And maybe we'll probably, I'm sure, get more into this in our conversation, but each of those has different objectives that you describe, but it also has maybe different parameters that you want when you do the burning in terms of intensity or timing. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely. There's differences, very important difference on when the fire would be conducted, how it would be conducted.
Starting with that, with the seedbed preparation burning, sometimes I think of that as almost like a maintenance burning too. How early in a rotation, like say, so you're going through probably even age management and using this, how early in that rotation would you consider using seedbed prep burning for oak as a part of oak management?
I would wait really till you're ready to begin the regeneration process. You're right at the very beginning of the regeneration process. I wouldn't be using it in a mid-rotation stand where regeneration is still decades away. I'd be looking more, say you had a 100-year rotation for an oak forest, I'd be looking at probably the age 80 to 90 to begin that. It's being done, like I say, to open up that understory very gently. So when there's an acorn crop, seedlings have a chance to start to grow. Basically, the forester at that point in time is making a decision that he wants to regenerate that particular oak stand.
Could you, and I've seen people use it slightly earlier, trying to keep invasives at bay or the mesophytic species. Could that be a role for fire in that situation, or would you turn to different tools at that point?
Earlier in rotation, I would be leaning much more towards herbicide than fire, because just the threat of damage to the trees and the boles of the trees. Oaks with their thicker bark, you can still certainly put fire scars on them. You can certainly kill them. And I'd want to guard against doing anything to decrease the value of the stand.
Would there be kind of an intensity that you would expect or find desirable for seedbed prep?
Generally, you're going to be looking at, I think, flame lengths under 2 foot, and season of burning is not as critical. You have, I think, a wider window because you're going to end up doing multiple burns when you're doing seed prep burning. Part of the reason is you're burning at lower intensity. A lot of times you're going to be burning during the dormant season. The fire simply won't have as much bang for the buck as you would if you were burning later in the growing season. You know, fire's not been in the stand for quite a number of years. It takes a while to basically get it back into the mode of burning. You're looking at a lower intensity fire, like I say, dormant season fire, probably multiple fires. Prepare for whenever you get an acorn crop. And once you get an acorn crop, then you put the drip torch away. You do not want to be burning shortly after an acorn crop. That's a recipe for a disaster.
You're doing these seedbed preparation burns, and then say you get a good bumper crop of acorns, and you don't want to put fire in at that point, obviously, because that fire would also destroy those acorns or those new germinates, but you just kind of let it go at that point, correct?
Yeah, once you're doing seedbed preparation burning, because there's not enough seedlings there on the ground to begin with, or no seedlings at all. So you're doing it to prepare the environment for their germination and early success. Once you get that acorn crop and those seedlings are starting to grow, you do not want to be using fire then. Fire readily kills acorns. It readily kills young oak seedlings.
What size do those seedlings, and again, I think we're going to get into this as we talk about things like the shelterwood burn technique, but what size did those seedlings become more resistant to fire?
Generally, you want your seedlings to have at least a 1/4-inch root collar diameter, which is the size of a number 2 pencil.
Yeah.
Think of a drinking straw, 22 caliber bullet, something like that. You want that to be at least that size. I like to see them probably up closer to a 1/3 to a 1/2 inch root collar diameter before I put fire in there. Whenever I'm going to be doing a release burn, I'm looking at 2 things. One is do the oaks have their root systems underneath them? Are they that 1/3 to 1/2 inch root collar diameter? And 2, do they have a competition problem? Are the maples and birch or whatever outgrowing the oaks? And only when I have both of those conditions met do I light the match. If you're fortuitous enough that you don't have a competition problem, the oaks are doing fine, there's no reason to burn.
Hmm.
Same token, if the oaks haven't developed enough yet, you just have to wait and be patient.
So it sounds like the two key things we need for the release burning are we need the presence of seedlings that can respond or rebound after the fire, but then we need some kind of competition that's basically getting in their way. Is that right?
Correct.
And when you're applying the fire in that situation, how is that different than, like, say, intensity, flame length, things like that? How would that be different than what we were using for the seedbed preparation?
For controlling competition for doing a release burn, you really want to be looking at a mid-spring burn. The leaves to be coming out on the understory. Notice, here in Pennsylvania, generally there's about a 2-week window between the time the maples and the birch and yellow poplar and whatnot open and develop their leaves, and then the oaks green up about 2 weeks later. It's about a 2-week window where the oaks are still dormant. And that's the ideal time, that mid-spring window, to burn, because the mesophytic species are very susceptible to fire kill at that time. And if they either don't sprout, or if they do, they're not very competitive sprouting because they've depleted a lot of their root reserves. If you're looking at a mid-spring burn, I generally would like to see higher fire intensities. The fire intensities are probably in the 2 to 4 foot range. Here in Pennsylvania, those conditions are usually second, third, fourth week of May. Common mistake a lot of people make is they jump the gun and they burn when everything is still dormant, and the fire doesn't really do very much in terms of changing those competitive relationships.
That would probably be similar time frame in Wisconsin, Brad, don't you think? Or maybe a little bit into June?
That's a really good question, because it sounds like, if I hear what you're saying right, Pat, we want most everything else to be leafed out, and then we kind of want that oak to be slightly behind and really hit the other stuff, right?
Correct.
Yeah. Which actually might be, like, I was just out this morning, and so we're getting bud break on our oaks, and we're getting some leaf development and some other things, but I would think maybe a week or two and right now we're kind of in the very end of April, so we may be similar.
Yeah, we're a little bit ahead on green up this year in Pennsylvania because we had a mild winter.
Yeah.
And so things are a little bit advanced this year, but generally for us, it's been the second week of May has been particularly a good time for burning. We tend to get a stretch of dry weather often in May, and say that the maples, the birch, poplar, whatever, is already partially leafed out at least. And a lot of times the oaks are still dormant or just barely breaking bud. At that time, the fire is very, very effective at changing the competitive relationships among those species.
One thing I've had the impression from reading some of your stuff in the past is that the intensity of the fire, so that flame length, that actually the more intense actually would give you maybe a little bit. If I had to choose between less intense on a day or more intense, I might go with the more intense, simply because you're going to get better control on those other things. And even though you're going to get some mortality in the oak, you won't get as much.
Correct. Species like red maple, fire intensity becomes very important. If you burn it at low intensity, red maple will readily sprout back as well as any of the oaks will. It's when you get to the higher intensities that those two species separate. The oaks sprout back much better than the red maples at a higher intensity.
How much of those oaks are you killing in that release burn and resprouting? Or is that going to vary on the size of the?
Yeah, it's generally, I'm going to say 10 to 15% of your oak seedlings will be completely killed, not sprout again. Most of the time, oaks have their root collars down in the soil a little bit. 2 reasons for that. One, acorns get buried by squirrels, blue jays, whatever. So when the acorns germinate, they're already down in the ground. And then 2, they have hypogeal germination. So the root collar actually forms down in the ground. The soil protects the root collar. Some oaks inevitably end up with that root collar up higher into the leaf litter. And those are ones that are killed by fire and not able to sprout. The sprouting comes from dormant buds at the root collar.
I'm also hearing you saying, Pat, and maybe through reading, I'm just also reading into this, is that foresters shouldn't be concerned with that oak mortality with that release burn. Usually they're going to come back. It's more important to get that intensity to kill those competitors.
Yeah, you're always going to lose some oak almost regardless of what fire intensity you burn at, simply by how they germinated is makes them susceptible to fire. But the higher the intensity, you have a much larger proportion of the maple population or whatever that's going to be susceptible to complete kill by the fire, to mortality.
Pat, I know, and we've talked about this, the seedbed prep and the release burning. And I know in a talk that I saw you do, and it was either online or, and I can't remember where it was, but you also talked about post-harvest prescribed burning. Where are we at with that? Is that something that people are doing or not doing, or what's the deal with that?
Research-wise, there's still, I think, some research that needs to be done here. Where I've seen that done here in Pennsylvania and elsewhere, it's incredibly useful in terms of putting the oaks to an advantage. Some of the best oak regeneration I've seen here in Pennsylvania stands that were burned 2 or 3 years after the final harvest. Honestly, I think that might be the way to go. It can be scary for people to do if they're not used to dealing with fire, because you can get some tremendously high fire intensities. In an oak shelter wood, you're going to have 20 to 25 tons of fuel on the ground per acre. After a final harvest, that number is going to be more like around 40 to 45 tons. You're going to basically double your fuel load. You get the sun beating down on that and get it dried out, and you set fire to it the spring of the year. It's going to burn hot, and it may be uncomfortable for people who are not used to dealing with fire.
So that's essentially another release burn, right?
Yes.
Just much more intense and a little later in the game.
Yeah, it's another form of release burn. It is done at the end of the harvest. All the trees they're going to the mill, have gone to the mill. That's one of the advantages of it, is there's no chance of doing any fire damage to the reserve trees. They've already been harvested. That's one of the things I like about it, is that negative factor is out of the way. But like I say, it can be a uncomfortable burn for people to carry out if they're not used to dealing with fire.
And it sounds like, again, there the release we had before, you basically need to have that oak there beforehand, and Correct. It has to have that competition that's basically causing it some problems.
Yes. Yeah. Here you have large oak reproduction, oak saplings, but you have saplings of mesophytic species there that are taller than them, growing faster than them. So yeah, those are the two conditions.
Pat, in this oak regeneration process that we've just been talking about, from preparing a seed bed to getting that acorn crop and germination, and then developing those into these competitive size oak reproduction, what kind of light levels do those new germinants need in order to get to that competitive size?
Okay, good question. Generally, in undisturbed mature oak stands, you're going to be down around 5% of full sunlight, and that's not enough sunlight for oak seedlings to survive or grow in. You get that up between 5 and 10%, the oak seedlings will survive, but they're not going to grow much at all. Once you get up above 10 to 15% full sunlight, then you're going to start seeing growth in the oak reproduction, especially if it's northern red oak. The other oak species, not quite so much. They tend to need a little bit more light. Northern red oak simply is more adaptable to lower light levels than most of the other oak species. So you say you want to get basically around 15% of full sunlight, which in terms of a shelterwood stand, you're probably looking at a shelterwood prep cut, some sort of mid-story removal or low shade removal. That would usually get you around 15%.
That was one of my questions. Could you get to that level with just, in a lot of our stands, doing a mid-story removal, like a non-commercial treatment?
Yeah, that should get you in the neighborhood of 15%. And the oaks that are there on the ground will respond. Like I say, the northern red oak will respond better than the other ones, especially the white oak just grows slow. It takes it a while.
Right.
And then once they have had a chance to develop, and then you can go forward with release cut in a shelter wood, take off half of the overstoring, put you up to 30-40% full sunlight. In that case, then the oaks, it's pretty much, for the oaks, it's the same as being out in full sunlight. It does keep the growth of the mesophytic species somewhat dampened because they're not in full sunlight.
Is there any caveats if you have like a strong herbaceous layer? For example, I know out east, and I know even in Wisconsin, sometimes we run into fern layers that cast a lot of shade.
Yeah, some interfering understory vegetation, such as different ferns. Here in Pennsylvania, we have mountain laurel, which is a ericaceous evergreen shrub. Those need to be dealt with, and usually herbicides are the best way to to get rid of those things at the very beginning of the regeneration process. A couple different approaches. If you have oak mixed in with fern, there's a couple different herbicide approaches where you can remove the fern and not hurt the oak.
I've seen it actually, even in those real dense fern layers, a misblow of herbicide over the top that killed the ferns, but the new germinants were fine underneath it.
Yes.
So it sounds like we're talking, like, for what you were describing there, thinking about the light levels, that we wanted to get that light on the ground, or at least make sure we have that. So we were talking about a shelter wood prep, a seed cut, and then that overstory removal. So 3 stages of a shelter wood, maybe, as opposed to some of our 2. What kind of time frame, if foresters are thinking about trying to plan for some of this, how long should they devote, say, because I think oftentimes what happens is people say, oh, it's time to regenerate, but you're already at a mature stand and they want to do it right now. How much time should we be putting into planning to really encompass all of the work that we need to do?
Okay, I want to back up and answer a question that need to cover here. You said about a seed cut in oak forests. In my opinion, that's not the correct terminology. We have a shelter wood. We have a shelter wood prep cut, which is the mid-story removal, sort of set the stage for things. Then you have release cuts. Oak stands, you never ever do a seed cut to establish oak seedlings. That works fine if you're dealing with yellow poplar, black cherry, pine, something like that. But for oaks, you're talking about a 2-stage or a 3-stage shelter wood. And a 3-stage shelter wood, you have the prep cut, and then the first release cut, and then the final release cut. And then in the 2-stage shelter wood, the prep cut is not there. So, the most common mistake I have ever seen in my career is people don't have oak seedlings on the ground. They decide they're going to regenerate the oak forest by doing a shelter wood. There's no oak seedlings there to begin with, and they end up with a failure.
Yeah. I would totally agree with that, Pat, and I'm guilty of it. We, in the past, would have said, oh, we're going to do a shelter wood system to regenerate this oak. But we didn't take the time to really see, as you were saying, if we had the oak on the ground. We opened up the canopy to that degree, and we simply just released all the competition.
Yeah.
Correct.
That reminded me, because I've talked to other more southern foresters, and they've always said, if you're going into shelter wood and you don't have it, you're not going to get it, which kind of the way we've always, and I think we've probably always been not quite right in the way we've done it. And that's kind of contributed probably to some of the oak regeneration problems we have too. We get to that point and we're like, okay, let's get it and get going. And then I think we get lucky once in a while and it works.
We get impatient and say now and then we get lucky.
Yep.
Like we're coming at this from sort of, which is good, the basics, but what we're really getting at too is this shelter wood burn technique that you've written about for many years, and I've been reading about it, I know, for well over a decade. And I read something in one of those publications, and I wrote it down, and you said, referring to the subtleties of regenerating oak forests with the shelter wood system. And I think that's just what we're talking about here, is just you have to understand sort of that biology, those silvics of that system. Otherwise, you can make these mistakes so easy.
Yeah, the oak regeneration process can take anywhere from 5 years to 25 years. And more often than not, it's going to be in the 15 to 25 year range. You can have some oak stands regenerate very quickly. Here in Pennsylvania, we have chestnut oak, which is an incredibly good sprouting oak species on dry sites. And you can basically cut it and it will regenerate entirely from sprouts, coppice. Yeah, that's an oak forest that you can regenerate very quickly. Most of the time, though, when we're dealing with black oak, white oak, northern red oak, we're looking at a 15, 20, or 25 year process from start to finish. It's inherently slow for 2 reasons. One is acorn crops are sporadic. There's no 2 ways about it. They don't happen every year. Here in Pennsylvania, we might get a good bumper crop once or twice a decade. And secondly, when oak seedlings are young and they're growing, that stem isn't growing much at all. They're developing those big root systems. Those 2 factors make the oak regeneration process slow. Throw problems in on top of it. You have too many deer. You get defoliations by gypsy moth or whatever, and all of a sudden that process becomes even longer because those sort of obstacles just sort of slow or stall the whole process.
So foresters should really be looking at these stands 5 to 15 years out to start assessing and planning for these things?
Yes, absolutely. They need to be looking at a mature stand and thinking 5, 10 years down the road. And they need to be looking, do they have an adequate seed source of oak in the overstory to begin with? You're going to need, say, at least 20 basal foot per acre, mature saw log size oaks to get the acorn. If the stand's already been damaged by a storm or by prior harvesting or something, and you don't have the oak basal area there and mature saw logs to begin with, you're not going to get the acorn. You need to be looking at, here in Pennsylvania, we have to constantly be looking at our deer impact and how much browse pressure the deer are going to be putting on the forest. Looking at what site quality is incredibly important for oaks, and making sure that you have the right oaks on the right sites. You'll be looking at the number of oak seedlings you have, their sizes. Here in Pennsylvania, we've been developing dominance probabilities that basically look at, here's a cohort of oak seedlings of various sizes and species. How many of them are going to survive through the regeneration process and be saplings at year 15? Now, foresters need to be looking at these things in stands before they begin putting paint on trees. Here in Pennsylvania, you're doing inventory is what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
You're taking stock of what is going on in the stand, both in terms of its positive attributes regarding regeneration, and then what obstacles you're going to be faced with.
And now a word from our sponsors.
Today's episode of SilviCast is brought to you by the Nelson Paint Company. Since 1940, foresters all over North America have relied on Nelson Paint for tree marking solutions. Nelson Paint manufactures paint designed to withstand the harshest weather conditions in the field, and the NelSpot tree guns have lasted the test of time. Visit nelsonpaint.com to learn more about their products.
Looking for heavy-duty construction and forestry equipment? Check out McCoy Construction and Forestry, your John Deere dealer. With 16 dealerships spanning the Midwest, McCoy offers new or used construction and forestry equipment, rental, parts and service, and product support. Visit McCoyCF.com and follow them on social media to see what McCoy has to offer.
And now back to our show. Pat, on those probabilities of survival and recruitment, do you have any general numbers for foresters to go by on how many seedlings per acre they would need of these competitive sizes?
Competitive is an interesting word in that what exactly defines a competitive oak seedling is constantly changing, because it depends on the site quality you're on. It depends on what the competition is growing next to the oak seedling. It depends on the species of the oak and what size it is to begin with. Is it a stump sprout or is it a seedling? What the deer pressure is there. So any sort of fixed number is, be nice if we had something that was that easy and straightforward, but it's not.
Yeah.
Decades ago, Ivan Sander at the Missouri lab came up with the standard of 4.5 foot, 435 oak seedlings per acre, 4.5 foot tall. And if you are able to achieve that, you're in real good shape. Probably going to be successful in regenerating oak. And I'd say that's a benchmark, but it's also sort of a high benchmark. And it's sometimes oaks that are not quite that tall and not quite that numerous will make it, depending on all these other factors. Other times, I've seen oaks that are 5 foot tall get buried by competition and end up dying.
And maybe cycling back to the fire a little bit. So in that situation, or thinking about this, so we've talked about kind of these events, like the different types of burn. I think based on what I've seen from some of your stuff before, we might expect to use like the site prep burn or maybe even release burn, maybe use those multiple times as part of the oak regeneration process.
Very likely, especially seedbed prep burning. Again, because acorn crops are sporadic and you're burning at a lower intensity a lot of times during the dormant season, it may take 2, 3, 4 of these fires, to have the impact on the understory you need, create that diffuse shade, and 2, till you get an acorn crop. Release burns, 1, sometimes will do the job if it's hot enough, or it's going to do as much a job as the fire is actually going to do to help that stand along. Sometimes 2, but I've seen singular fires in the shelterwood process work and do an admirable job in regenerating the oak. Get into where you can take the overstory off.
Yep. And do we still think of like accumulating oak as a part of that seedbed prep with those burns too?
Yes, you're looking at accumulating oak seedlings to begin with. Starting down the regeneration path with several thousand oak seedlings per acre. Time you get to the final harvest, you may be down to just a few hundred per acre, but they're good competitive larger oak stems or saplings that are going to be able to go forward and become the overstory of a future oak stand.
Pat, in that shelterwood burn technique, we're looking at maybe doing that preparatory cut, try to get those at least minimal light levels so that those new germinants can start to put on a little bit of size. But in some stands, I know, particularly on our drier habitat types, where we have less competition, we might develop some fairly sizable oak regeneration. Then in those situations, can we just go to the final removal harvest if we really have that competitive oak in the understory?
Yes. Once you have oaks that are considered competitive for that site, the competition isn't there with them, or it's there, but it's equal with the oaks. Yeah, it's time to go ahead and take off the overstory.
But then we still might then employ one of the release burns if we have that competition that's kind of all, fighting with the oak as well.
Yeah. After you do a final harvest, you really should walk through the stand 2 or 3 years later and see how the oaks are doing and what sort of competition they have next to them. Mm-hmm. Are they dealing with an aggressive long-term species that's going to be a problem for them, or is it something that they're going to be able to outgrow in a few years? Are they competing against a fast-growing yellow poplar, or are they competing against a staghorn sumac? It matters.
So almost like a free-to-grow type of assessment.
Yes.
So, Brad's laughing at me.
I can hear that conversation coming, Greg.
Because we've had different arguments about things when we're bored and just talking silviculture. Pat, it's just something Brad and I do.
Yeah. So, the one burn we haven't really talked about, Pat, was the ecological restoration burning. And does that kind of, in a way, encompass like what we're doing with the seedbed prep and the release burning, but not maybe in an organized fashion?
Yeah, the ecological restoration, generally the oak stands have a different purpose. I'm talking seedbed preparation or release burn. I'm usually thinking of commercial harvest, sending the oak logs to the sawmill. Ecological restoration may very well never involve harvesting the overstory trees. What you're doing is grading the open understory that you have oak seedlings there. So when those overstory mature oaks do die off, they're knocked down by a windstorm or ice storm or something, that there's oak seedlings there to come up afterwards. Now, these are oak trees that are not necessarily meant to go to the sawmill. And it's also that creating that open understory where you can have you're interested in other aspects of the forest in terms of maybe herbaceous plant layers and things like that the fire will also have effects on. So
is it important in those systems to have a fire-free period to allow some replacement of the canopy?
Yeah, eventually you're going to have it. If you look at any of the fire history studies, there's quite often gaps, sometimes of a couple decades or more, where there's simply no fires. That gives the opportunity for the regeneration to develop some size to it that it's able to survive a fire in the future. May very well have a cat face on it, a scarred butt, but the tree is able to survive. Yeah, if you're going to be burning every 2 or 3 years into perpetuity, none of those oak seedlings or anything else is going to be able to really grow and develop and become mature trees. You're going to end up with a grassland savanna sort of situation as trees die and not replaced.
So thinking about this oak regeneration problem, we've talked about kind of how fire can be used as that silvicultural tool to get over a lot of those barriers. Do you think fire is going to be enough to sustain our oak systems in the eastern U.S. if we were able to apply it on the scale that we need to?
Even if we were able to apply it on the scale that it needs to be applied, which is a whole another conversation. No, because there's so many other parts of the system are out of whack. Whenever you're burning, you run the risk of barnyarding deer into burned areas, where they will simply nibble away everything and anything green that pops up sprouting afterwards. So you're going to have to deal with deer issues if they're a problem. Two, there's plenty of invasive species now that are more than happy to invade into burned areas and become problematic. fire alone won't solve, won't address those problems, won't solve those problems. Dealing with invasives and deer are actually two of the things you need to keep an eye on when you're doing burning, that you don't actually create more problems than you solve.
If you could wave a wand and you use fire like you'd like to in our eastern oak forests, what would you like to see in the next 50 years?
Interesting question, because it's kind of like, at what point is the oak regeneration process the biggest problem?
Mm-hmm.
And generally, you can get oak seedlings to start growing in most stands. The bottleneck is getting those oak seedlings up to larger sizes that they can compete with the mesophytic species. So I guess I would say, if I could wave a wand where fire should be used, it should be used to the midpoint of the oak regeneration process towards the end, burning during a shelterwood sequence or after a final harvest. That's where the bottleneck is most of the time in oak forest.
So kind of that release burning
Yes.
Stage.
There
Yeah.
are other ways you can use herbicides to create an open understory. So the oak seedlings have that diffuse light level and can start growing. So you can do your seed bed prep to a degree with herbicides. I don't know how you're going to be able to use herbicides in a thick understory in a shelterwood stand where you have oak competing against a bunch of. There's no way to differentiate there among the species with the herbicides, whereas fire differentiates based on the size of the root systems.
Brad, you and I have had this conversation here in Wisconsin. We have, I would say, numbers of harvested areas that have some level of oak regeneration in them, but they're not competitive with all of the mesophytic hardwoods that we're talking about. And nobody goes and does a release burn or a mechanical release, and then we lose what oak we have. So I agree with you, Pat. I could see just a much wider use of it in that stage of the regeneration process.
Right at the end of my career, I'll be retiring here within the next year. In the last several years of my career, I've been looking more and more at the post-harvest environment and what is going on there with oak seedlings competing against the mesophytic species. And what we see here in Pennsylvania is we tend to, after the final harvest, have plenty of oak seedlings up until about year 5 to 7.
Yeah.
And then we have an absolutely massive die-off. So by the time the canopy closes at age 10 to 15 and you have a sapling stand, the oaks are gone, or they're in such bad shape that they're a non-factor. That's an area that's ripe for some management intervention.
That sounds really familiar, because we've seen that on a lot of sites here in Wisconsin, where 5 years, you go out after the harvest, everything looks great. You come back 5 years later and it's like a whole different world. Everything's gone.
Or we've done stands where we've done enrichment planting. You go back and you might still find the oak, but they're buried amongst all the competition.
Yeah, I really think this post-harvest burning within, say, 5 years of the final harvest is something that needs to be looked at more closely and thoroughly, and certainly I think needs to be implemented more in our stands during that phase of stand development, early part of the stand initiation phase. And then the other thing is, once you're up to canopy closure, I'm a huge advocate for crop tree management. Going in there and finding the co-dominant oaks that, if you don't release them, are probably going to end up losing the race 10 years down the road or so. Releasing your co-dominant oaks or other desirable species, whatever species you're wanting to favor. To me, crop tree management is sort of the very end of the whole regeneration sequence, where you go from managing the stand to literally managing 50 trees per acre.
So, and you've kind of answered this question a bit, Pat, is looking back on your research and then looking forward, what kind of research needs do we have? And you mentioned sort of that post-harvest environment.
Yeah.
Are there other things that you could see a need moving forward that we need to look more heavily at?
In terms of oak silviculture, yeah, I think it's really the post-harvest environment that needs plenty of research to it. The other one is going to be, I think, on degraded stands and how to rehabilitate oak stands that have been degraded for whatever reason. Jeff Ward, who was a colleague of mine from Connecticut Ag Experiment Station, he retired here last year. It started looking at what he referred to as a microstand approach. He had picked it up from somebody up in Canada, where you're assessing the stand and basically just the operational area of a skidder and how far the skidder can pull the chain, winch in logs, and coming up with some ideas on here's how you deal with these small portions of the stand, one at a time, in terms of rehabilitating. Some very interesting, thoughtful ideas from him, and hopefully whoever takes his place there continues on down that path, because he had some great ideas that certainly merited research.
Well, I certainly have a lot of those stands that probably don't meet that threshold you talked about of having enough oak seed source within them. So then it becomes extra challenging.
Yes.
So, Pat, I think we're going to get a lot of foresters and land managers who listen to this and say, this sounds pretty interesting. Maybe I should give fire another chance or a thought. Maybe I should examine how I'm going to put this in. If they're thinking about this, what would be first steps for, say, a land manager or forester to consider when thinking about how to introduce fire as a part of their management? And maybe what are some good resources you might point them to?
One of the chronic problems that always comes up with now fire, it works okay on public lands because we generally have the resources, the personnel to do the jobs. On private land, that's not the case. Until recently, I would say make friends with your local volunteer fire department. Have them help, one, get with a consulting forester to do the burn plan and direct the burn. If you can find a consulting forester who's got a background in fire and knows how to do it. But then coming up with the resources to do that, I say local volunteer fire departments that historically have been a way to go there. At least here in Pennsylvania, our fire department, our VFDs are really hurting for lack of people, the shadow of what they were 10, 20 years ago. And so I don't know if that is necessarily the resource that they used to be. Many years ago, I worked out in the Black Hills of South Dakota doing a lot of private lands forestry. We burned quite often out there on private lands. One, it's more open country, it's ranches and stuff, but the volunteer fire departments were our resource. We didn't have the people to do the job entirely. We made use of our VFDs, and it was great training for them. Developed a great relationship with them. So when we had wildfires, we already knew each other and stuff, and we could work together on wildfires. It was for people wanting to use this, especially in the private sector. I'd be finding consultants that have a background in fire, and there are going to be some of them out there, to finding the resources to be able to pull it off.
Would you recommend too that as a part of just the rest of the management that they're looking at, that they really put a lot of thought into fire breaks as a part of their management too?
Yeah, having fire breaks in place to begin with is good. Property I own here in Pennsylvania used to be an old farm, kept the tractor trail, the tractor paths up and stuff, and there are my fire breaks. And my son and I burn off portions of it every year or two, and just the two of us are able to do it because our fire breaks are already in place.
Pat, I really appreciate this conversation, and I might have said this in the beginning, but I also appreciate from your research the real practical nature of it that foresters can apply on the ground. And as you said, Brad, I hope foresters, and we try to encourage them, look at this research, the shelterwood burn technique, and really think about trying to do some of it, because I think you got to start somewhere. And then if we can have more success, I think that will gain more use of it overall. I just wanted to say that, Pat, I really appreciate that research. And I'm really glad that we got you on the show before you retire, says if you're retiring next year, as you say. So I think it's important to get that word out there. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Greg. I appreciate, like I said, the opportunity to talk with you and Brad today about this sort of thing. And hopefully it does some good.
I think this is going to be good. And I hope this kind of keeps the conversation going, because I know a lot of foresters have been talking about it, and we kind of go through fits and starts where we talk about it, we get excited about it, and then it kind of gets held back by implementing or by what's it going to do to the timber or things like that. So I think just all of the tools that you've provided that kind of help us refine and define the types of fire we're using, why we're using it, how we're using it, I think has been really big. And I think it's going to be really helpful from here on in.
Again, thank you, Pat, for coming on. It's been great talking with you. And I know our foresters will definitely listen in on this one.
Like I said, appreciate the opportunity to talk with both of you and enjoyed it.
Okay, take care.
Bye.
That music can only mean it's time for the Dropbox. The Dropbox is a regular segment where we take your comments, questions, tips, whatever you send, and we share them with our listeners.
Brad, we often get really great ideas for episode topics, right? And so I want to encourage the listeners out there to keep those coming because we do use them and we've used them in the past. But we also like to get questions that we can talk about in different episodes. So if you have a burning silvicultural question, please feel free to send it to us and we might be able to use it.
Right. And the silvicultural question doesn't need to be about burning. It's just a very
I didn't
that kind of
try
thing.
to make that joke.
Yeah. But I think that's right. And Greg, I think we need to incentivize our audience again. Remember, we did that a couple of years ago. We had a winner. We had everybody who sent in an idea or for a topic or a question.
I heard you were going to put up your minivan.
No, we're not going that far. But I think what did we give last? We won't go into it, but it was
we
big.
Won't go into it.
It was big. It was big. And so I would recommend anybody who sends in a question or an idea, we'll put you in the drawing at the end of the year and we'll have a huge prize. Greg, it's going to be big.
I'm going to leave that up to you, Brad.
It's big. It's going to be huge. Greg, that episode was on fire.
We flamed to please, Brad. And Pat was really bringing the heat.
I'm stoked about our next shelter wood.
I hate to say it, but these fire puns are way too easy. Take care, everyone. And as always, thanks to our team. Susan Barrett, our editor-in-chief, Logan Badon, our IT master, theme music by Paul Frater, and of course, UW Stevens Point's Wisconsin Forestry Center.